Hello. That might be wrong. That's just what she was told. Okay. Yeah, because that's just what Kendra was told. Yeah. Yeah, that's fine. Just whatever you guys want to do out there. I'm getting the stream right now. Sure.
You couldn't talk about Julian and WikiLeaks without being brought back to the stories about his personality and his putting feces on the wall and he's mean to the cat. And it took so much energy to debunk all these things until Nils Messer finally, shut the Swedish case with strong evidence that it was an entire fabrication. And but all this energy was wasted on him and his persona. And what I want today is that we go back to the fundamentals. We go back to the philosophy that brought WikiLeaks to life. A few years after the war in Iraq was started on lies, this guy wrote a piece of philosophy called Conspiracy as Governance, where he explained that governments hide their actions behind an increasing amount of secrets. And that secrets becomes the way of conducting about these lies and these crimes. And that if we could break the secret, if we could expose these secrets, then the governments would dedicate more and more energy hiding the secrets. And we would push the governments into some paranoia that would leave them less resources to commit their crimes. This is what WikiLeaks is about. WikiLeaks is this glorious encounter between hackers, the benevolent hackers, the hackers of free software, of a free internet, and their wit for using technology. And this is what is on the table right now. This is what is at stake. This is why Julian is being persecuted today. This is why Judge Barretzer and the whole British establishment is trying to crush him in this glass box with no access to nothing. You reported already that on Monday alone he was handcuffed 11 times, strip searched naked twice, brought about 5 different detention cells, and stripped of all his court documents and personal notes. This is not just for some alleged release of documents in 2010. It is for what Julian and WikiLeaks stand for. It is about trying to alter this balance of power. It is about exposing lies. It is about giving the power to everyone to in part in these activities.
And this abuse of power started several years ago, and we saw that in the Ecuadorian Embassy in London, and the UC Global case was also brought up earlier this week. I know that both of you have visited the embassy quite a bit, so if you're willing to talk about maybe what the conditions were like in that embassy.
Well, towards the end, Kristen can talk about towards the beginning, but towards the end, it was a very sadistic place. They increasingly isolated Julian. They installed cell phone jammers. They built a two-way glass box around the security desk so that he had no interaction with any human being for the entire, from Friday at 5 o'clock until Monday at 8. It was a constant incremental increase of pressure and isolation and vindictiveness in the hope that he would walk out of the embassy.
And be arrested. Yeah, I mean, it was extraordinary to see this slow process from actually that being a sanctuary. Fidel Navarez, the former consul and in the embassy, has been a good witness of how actually people were trying to coexist. It's a small compound, a small actually premise, but everything was made. Everybody was working hard on making this work, and it did work. It was a sanctuary. There was, of course, severe limitation on Julian, but we were able to come and go. We were able to work there, out of there, and keep the work going, and make it at least a bearable place to be in. Because I mean, Julian couldn't go out. There was no garden, just a small balcony that, it was really a serious issue with going out on that one. But when Lenin Moreno came to power, it just sort of there was a shift very quickly, and it became basically the sanctuary became a prison, a very tough place, and so it's a torture circumstances. And of course, then the spying that we know of now, you see global spying on Julian, all bankrolled and financed by Sheldon Adelson, the biggest bankroller of Donald Trump and the Republican Party, and of course this has come up in the court. It's quite astonishing that that alone, eavesdropping and gathering evidence, sending it to the American intelligence on communication between Julian and his lawyers, should, on its own merit, be enough to throw out the extradition. And you have how many other equally important, strong arguments? I think there are probably 18, where each an individual one should suffice. So, I mean, if this was a normal circumstances, not so highly politicized, it would be an open and shut case.
And just on that one point about the spying and the interference by private security firm UC Global, who were feeding information to the CIA. And actually, in fact, is beyond that, isn't it? It's also the fact that there were discussions about kidnapping Julian Assange or poisoning him as well. That is that very type of activity which resulted in the case against Daniel Ellsberg being thrown out when Daniel Ellsberg was charged under the Espionage Act in the United States. The fact that federal employees broke in, I don't know if it was FBI, broke into his psychiatrist's office, pouring through, stealing his documents to see what they could do. Could they smear him? What could they find out about him? And the judge in his case had said it had been so poisoned by all the various illegal activity that it wouldn't be possible for there to be a fair trial. And that's in the end why Daniel Ellsberg ended up getting off. And he was a whistleblower who technically violated secrecy official laws as an employee of the federal government, or at least as somebody who's working with the Rand Corporation and the Department of Defense, whereas Julian Assange is none of those things.
And that was breaching medical privilege. That wasn't even breaching legal. Well, Julian's medical privilege was breached as well, with videos of his doctor examining him, but also his legal privilege with his lawyers, the recordings of him with his lawyers.
The difference maybe is that back then it seems that some vague notion of rule of law and dignity of the court and vague respect to some of these was still prevailing. When here it seems we're in a completely farcical mockery of a trial, and not only the extradition trial here in the UK. Everything in the last 10 years about Julian Assange, whether in Sweden, in the UK, in the US, in Ecuador, everything has been extraordinary and illegal. And it seems that what you said, Tarek, earlier, that the case of Assange is a kind of a symbol of our times. It seems that what's happening to Assange is a kind of a mirror of this rise of a global fascism we are seeing about everywhere in the world, where country after country, the institutions seem to be dismantled, the rule of law seem to be abolished, police states. I come from France, and France turned into a police state happening over the last 10 years. We have been the manifestations of this rise of global fascism on our friend Julian, as if he was a kind of a lightning rod of the relationship between the people and those in power.
You can also, so taking exactly what you've said and translating it into the narrative that's been done, global fascism sounds really hard and wild and outrageous, and so as a result people just don't believe it. But if you look at the narrative arc of Julian's detention, it's been soft. The detention hasn't been soft, but it's been these small little technical issues, always a technicality as to why he wasn't charged ever in Sweden, why the prosecutors weren't able to come and question him here, why his asylum wasn't recognized by the UK, why even after Sweden had been dropped he couldn't be released, why there was a reason why he couldn't go to have medical attention in a hospital. It's constant, and it's always a little technical reason that is flagrantly contrary to their precedent or the law or anything that they've done in the past.
We all know the fact that you're right. I mean, there's a shadow sort of coming over in our days, very serious one. We call it neo-fascism, whatever label we're going to give it, but it's a strip of fundamental rights. So they are being stripped away little by little. And we can go through all the legal details of this week's proceedings, but what sort of sticks with me, apart from what we've already mentioned from today's proceeding, is this determination to twist and turn on the part of the prosecution. I mean, let's face it, this is a man, supplied by the Crown Prosecution Service. The arguments, the way that how far they're going to take it to argue that Julian should be extradited is by dismissing all elements of international law. Not just the treaty itself, which they are, partly abiding by but partly dismissing when it suits, but also the argument that the European Court of Human Rights, UN Convention, Interpol statutory agreements, and etc., London Agreement, all these, and it's sort of blatantly sort of pushed to the judge, all these agreements, everything that's been built up, as an attempt to create an international legal base, some civility in international relations, they're willing to push that to the side and destroy those mechanisms, and with such blatant terms, and it's stunning. And they are saying it, yes, we have a special understanding of these terms of what a political crime means. It's an Anglo-American one. We know that every other nation in the world views this differently. We don't care. We do it our way. And despite the international agreement, despite the European Convention on Human Rights, despite all these commitments, just don't matter at all. That's how badly they want it. At stake.
It's exactly that They ignored the Vienna Convention in relation to his asylum. They ignored 3 United Nations decisions on his arbitrary detention. Yeah,
Well, blatantly said in court. I mean,
that public international law doesn't matter.
yeah, and whatever the United Nations say, that has no bearing in my court.
Yeah.
Is what was presented by this magistrate in Westminster Court.
Which is ironic given the fact that the United Kingdom is a founding member of the United Nations. It also sits on the Security Council, which means it has a international legal obligation to implement peace and security, right? So the Security Council members are legally obligated to implement international law to ensure that international law is applied. And Britain does, if you see its involvement in international affairs, does bring up international law a lot. So it's not like these arguments which are raised here about customary international law and about the binding effects of certain legal instruments or legal policies. It's not like it's alien to this country. It's just that judges here, and this goes to the original point that you'd asked me about the distinction between UK legislation and the treaty, is that the prosecution is trying to rely on the principle that if there's a contradiction between British law and international law, British law always wins. That's basically the point they're trying to make.
Well, in this case, there isn't even a contradiction. It's just, it's not even mentioned. They're mute on the point, which means that there isn't a contradiction, which means that it can apply. Sometimes I wonder if the being on the Security Council, which gives you a veto right, also gives you a veto right to the protections that are supposed to be afforded.
Well, I spoke to Assange's U.S. lawyer. Mr. Pollack, who's a criminal defense lawyer based in Washington, D.C. And we discussed the fact that under the U.S. Constitution, it explicitly states that this country will be bound by the law of nations. So they exist in theory, but when you try to apply them in practice, it becomes a much more difficult issue.
I think the point I wanted to raise was kind of very similar to you, but I think even the rise of WikiLeaks and the rise of Julian Assange comes in a very specific context of Western society becoming more tyrannical over time. And I've heard this kind of expression being used a lot of, it's kind of the last days of Rome, where we're seeing laws and everything being slowly kind of being chipped away, and there's a fracturing of the West. We're seeing Brexit in Spain, in France it's fracturing, America looks like it's nearing civil war, with how polarized it's becoming. So that seems like it's happening in the West at the moment.
India, Brazil, it doesn't stop at the West, unfortunately.
And that's a very kind of grim circumstance of all of that. But I was wondering if anyone kind of saw anything that was kind of signs of potential hope or things moving in a more positive direction going forward.
Not in the court this week, not in my opinion. I think, it is almost an outcome that has been determined, as we saw today when the magistrate brings to court the decision on a ruling, before she hears the argument. This is the second time in a few months that I see exactly the same thing happening. For example, when Julian got the most severe sentence for skipping bail, and his lawyers came into the sentencing for that hearing with loads of arguments, mitigating arguments. Usually this is settled with a small fine or a very, very short prison sentence, which is usually not served. All the arguments that he was using his international rights to seek asylum, and that he was right to fear for his safety, to enter the Ecuadorian Embassy, etc., etc. The magistrate listened to all the arguments with total disinterest and then just took the paper that she had brought in her hand into the courtroom and just read out what she came pre-written. That doesn't give you confidence that you have any chance or any hope. But the arguments are there. I mean, what can we see? I mean, we have to fight on. I mean, Julian has to fight on. This will probably go into appeal, Supreme Court, possibly, and even to the European Court of Human Rights. So, I mean, it's a long process that we might have ahead of us. But and in that period, of course, I fear for my friend and colleague because he will not last years and years in this Belmarsh prison and the condition he is in.
Do we have time just for one more point on that, actually, because it's for whatever reason, there's certain things I think we're each affected differently. There's certain things that sort of stick in. And for me, the fact that the lawyers keep bringing up his prison conditions. I recall in November, they bring up his prison conditions, what's going on in prison. He's not getting proper access to his lawyers. They say not enough time, not enough FaceTime. He's not getting access. The laptop, which took over the conditions over which he's held in prison. That's something to do with the prison authorities. Then in January, when Gareth Pearce presented precedent of here's another judge who literally got on the phone and called Belmarsh prison governor and told them to intervene in a similar situation, and they did. She didn't consider that to be enough for her to then do the same. And then just the other day, as you raised, the fact that he was within a single day, handcuffed 11 times, strip searched twice, 5 separate holding cells that he's being put back and forth in, and then having his legal papers, his confidential legal papers taken from him. The judge, instead of being outraged that there's this major interference in her court proceedings, and she could have literally have called the prison governor from across from the next building on.
Yes.
She could have, because Belmarsh is just right there. Instead, her response was almost one of irritation that they had yet again brought up this issue of his prison conditions. Almost like, why are you, I've already told you. The fact that you're escalating, the fact that his situation is getting worse in terms of his mistreatment doesn't change the fact that I don't consider myself to be. So she could write a letter to the Advocate General. She could do all kinds of things. She could seek the assistance of the Chief Justice, Chief Magistrate to say, well, okay, well, what can I do if there's a fair trial that's being interfered with by prison authorities? But she's just basically, this is beyond...
There's nobody disputing, not even the judge is disputing that everything that is being said about Julian's access to his lawyers is true. It's, they're not arguing with that. They're just saying, not my problem.
The magistrate, of course, then adds to it with that process by saying, basically, that she doesn't have a jurisdiction to let him out of the glass cave, and she has to be forced actually into that position. Yes, you do have actually power to do so. So I mean, in every step of the way, where there's an attempt to sort of alleviate situation, she will try to raise the fact that she doesn't have any power to do so, neither in her courtroom or in the prison conditions.
Didn't the prosecution also raise an issue about the fact that didn't they also agree that it's an issue that Assange wasn't getting proper access to his lawyers, or did they not weigh in at all on that?
I can't remember if they weighed in on that.
I mean, resolve matters.
Well, it makes sense that they would want that. They would want matters resolved because that gives them a greater passport to prosecute their entire case and not have any allegation of interference.
Yeah, the appearance of impropriety. So at the very least, they want it to appear like a fair hearing. Just one correction, it's not a trial, because in a trial,
Sorry.
you have, no, you didn't say that. I was just saying, because earlier, And
I
people
thought it was strange.
people during the week and the previous weeks have constantly been referring to this process as a trial, but it's not a trial. It's not a trial. In a trial, you have in a civil court, you have a balance of probabilities, criminal, guilt beyond reasonable doubt, and that is both placed on the prosecuting. In this case, the burden of proof literally is on the defense. It's flipped over, and it's not a fact-finding mission in the same way the trial would be. It's more up to Assange's legal team to convince the judge that the presumption in favor of extradition to the United States can be overcome in this case.
In fact, the prosecution even said, when they were talking about one element, it is not our business. It is not for us to determine the facts of this case. We are not interested. Basically, they're not interested in facts.
Yeah.
Joined by another special guest, the former ambassador to Ecuador, Fidel Narvaez. If I pronounced that incorrectly, please correct it for our viewers. And thank you so much for joining us. If you could provide us with just your background and your perception of what took place today and earlier this week.
Thank you. Just small correction. I was not the ambassador, but I was the consul of Ecuador when Julian requested asylum and when the asylum was granted in 2012.
Okay, thank you for the clarification.
And I worked for the embassy for many years, and I was 6 years of the 7 years of Julian Assange inside the embassy, with him, seeing him at a daily basis, and doing my best to protect him.
Can you talk about the conditions in the embassy? Our other two guests, Christian and Joseph, were able to speak on that, but if you could talk about that as well. We know that UC Global, the Spanish security firm, was spying on Assange and others who were in the embassy for some time. That was brought up in court as well.
Sure. I will happily refer to that. But because I missed the previous discussion, and you were on the point of Julian not being allowed to be with his lawyers and kept behind a glass box. My only comment to that is that they doesn't look so threatening, like a guy who needs to appear behind the box with 2 security guards close to him. So it's a question of image, I think.
Just on that point, and I think we're very fortunate to have people that actually know Julian intimately, and I think one of the main issues actually is the amount of misperception of who he is as a person. So maybe if we can kind of get some thoughts on, what's your experience of him as a person, and that.
Well, to start with, if I can begin, I mean, I've known him for 10 years now. We befriended when he was in Iceland, and that was before the revelations or the release of 2010. I mean, a thoughtful, intellectual, a totally non-violent, peaceful man, just to add that. And the perception that is being presented, and Niels Meltzer, the Special Rapporteur on Torture, has been pointing out actually, which is one has observed throughout the years, which is astonishing, that an almost a caricature image has been created of him, a villain's image in the mainstream media, and it is basically propaganda, deliberate propaganda effort. And it escalated. I mean, it got worse and worse throughout the years. And just before he was dragged out of the embassy in this despicable manner, after this betrayal of Lenin Moreno, it reached a peak of where you were sort of presented in the mainstream media with an image of a total lunatic, a total crazy guy who was smearing feces on the wall and abusing his cat and what have you. It was just outrageous. You just wondered, I mean, how can he come up with these things? And all of us who know him personally, can testify to counter that image. I mean, we are talking here about a highly intellectual individual who has highly good motivations for his work, and it is just astonishing for me as a journalist for 30 years who have witnessed this sort of happening. And one wonders, I mean, you can take pretty much anybody and create a monster out of him in a concentrated effort. I mean, who will be next? A statesman that Tony Blair could kiss on the cheeks in the desert and drink tea with him into being a monster and then going back and forth. We saw Saddam Hussein being the best friends of everybody.
Bashar al-Assad.
Yeah, Bashar al-Assad, so that this is, we're used to that. But it must be of grave concern that you could just, and of course we know that this is a creation, a mental construct. It has no bearing on reality. Sorry for the long answer, but I mean, I would like to take that into that context. I have never equated the public image of Julian, and I mean, he's a rather shy person. He was in the beginning. He was very reluctant in the beginning actually to be in the public spotlight. I and my colleague actually had to sort of force him a little bit out because the WikiLeaks needed at that time in 2010 a face. So I mean, he was very reluctant, always very reluctant to be in the public spotlight. He's not the person that seeks it or has a vanity to seek fame or any motive that is spurious. So he is not the Bond villain, which he ended up being sort of depicted as in the end.
So before we do wrap it up here, Joseph, I want you to just give some of your insight on where it goes from here and what you expect this outcome to look like. Not a prediction necessarily, but just what we can expect as far as this extradition hearing. It's not over, and there's a lot more evidence to come in this case. And everybody watching right now, this is the Watchdog Live. We are about to wrap up our first segment, so make sure you do retweet. Make sure you also go to thewatchdog.net. There is coverage of the full Julian Assange extradition hearings there. My video footage and Tarek's work and many others.
On the 7th of April, which ironically also happens to be Daniel Ellsberg's birthday. And then on the 18th of May, we'll begin the second part of the hearing. That will involve a lot of live evidence. Today in court, in fact, they were hammering out the final details of witnesses and anonymous witnesses, and just to what extent they can and are allowed to be anonymous. So this will relate to the UC Global case that was brought to, there was evidence from which was gathered by whistleblowers who want to maintain their anonymity, of course. But you have to remember that the prosecution's client is the United States government. So whereas Julian was saying that his hearing is unequitable with that of the prosecution because they get to confer with their lawyers all the time, they being unnamed embassy officials who will then, during this case, be able to find out who those witnesses are. So we've got some anonymous witnesses to come. Oh, the point of that is that just how far up does that anonymity put those people in danger of being politically exposed and politically persecuted? We've seen from the defense team's opening just how much this case is politically motivated. There is a lot more to come. Very detailed technical arguments documents, anonymous witnesses, evidence giving, some very interesting stuff that is not necessarily technical. And we already know that irrespective of which side wins, the other will appeal, but we've got some very, very good arguments, and I think that there's greater precedent at the High Court stage.
But also as a way to answer your question earlier, to what is there here for hope, and also maybe towards the end to extract ourselves a little bit from this dragging atmosphere, soul-crushing atmosphere of an extradition hearing and not a trial. Thanks, Mo. Remember 10 years ago, collateral murder, the Iraq war log, the Afghanistan war log, the cable gate. This enabled each and every one of us to gain an unprecedented understanding of the world. And this is what WikiLeaks is about, using technology that is in everybody's hands to allow anonymous publication of vast troves of documents we can search into to make sense of in an uncensorable way. 10 years ago, we were still nurturing this dream that a free internet would make the world a better place, would enable us to challenge power. And in the meantime, it seems that the dream has almost died out. We've learned through the spy files, we learned through when Google met WikiLeaks, how this global consortium of governments and companies infiltrated each and every bit of the technologies we use every day, and how this brought about this to bring this collective capacity to make sense of all that shit, to bring back a political message and not get swamped into the legalese, in a way maybe to make WikiLeaks wiki again. And as a matter of fact, is a wiki called challengepower.info as a homage to Gavin McFadden that has been put up online some times ago to help everyone who wants to participate. It's a wiki, it's a collective effort to help everyone to try and contribute and make sense of all this and somehow prepare a collective, uncensorable future.
Kristinn, as the editor-in-chief of WikiLeaks, why don't you leave us off with your final message?
Well, of course, we will continue to publish as we have, despite the serious situation, the future of journalism, and in a broader sense as well, as I was mentioned earlier. Jeremy said we need to rekindle the dream, find the dream, the vision. For me, it's not an option. If we don't go back to that, if we don't go back to the core values and fight on that front, we have only other option is a nightmare and darkness, and that's where we head into. So I see this as a front line. This is the front line today. This is the line that we will have to take a stand, and that's why I'm doing it, and I hope more will join.
All right, I want to thank all of our guests for joining us this evening. We are going to wrap it up, but we will be returning the Watchdog Live. We have more guests. It'll be about 5 minutes, so make sure you stick with us.
Julian Assange's case sets many